2020, a year never imagined. The world on lockdown, flights seized, borders closed, funerals, intimate FaceTime calls, communities isolated, food banks full. George Floyd's murder filmed, international uproar. The world rose, black boxes posted. Worldwide, thousands marched, chants of Black Lives Matter. Communities demanding for their rights, an end to institutional racism taking lives. Demands for human life to be valued, for equality, dignity and justice. More than just tick boxes. Inclusivity across the board. Employ more black people in senior positions. Makeup brands, a more considerate shade palette. Corporations to incorporate demands, make products more accessible. The UK now enters a deep recession. How will brands support pockets affected? How will they campaign and support the most marginalised? How will they be inspired by Marcus Rashford's campaign for free school meals? Ben & Jerry's speaking up for people seeking refuge, highlighting people travelling by sea can't be legal, an asylum claim shouldn't be impacted, stated in the 1951 Refugee Convention. How will brands not just scroll past when humanity is in a shattering hourglass? How will they honour their solidarity more than just a tick box? What policies will be put in place so racist slurs aren't tolerated? How will they create safe spaces for those most impacted? How accessible? How will they ensure post-COVID more roles for disabled people to earn from home? What investments will be made, collectively working towards the same aim? There is hope for improvement, lessons and change, resilience and recovery. What responsibility will you take?
Good morning and welcome back to the Kantar Talks series. Hopefully you've in the interim enjoyed the poem by Sharifa Energy. I'm joined here today by Charlie Warwick from our Futures practice. I'm Bernard Vessels and I head up the digital commerce practice for Kantar Consulting. And we're going to be talking about the next decade of digital commerce. It's quite a long time. So Charlie, tell us, what do you expect the changes that we will see in the next 10 years?
Thank you so much, Bernard. And it is my pleasure today to be hopefully taking you a step back and a step out of your day-to-day, this mania that surrounds us, your present pressures and priorities, to take a slightly longer view. And when I say a longer view, just as Bernard says, this is the 2030 future of digital commerce. Now, as humans, we don't engage with this sort of futures thinking exercise very often, and that's understandable. The future is full of uncertainty, and it's uncomfortable to think in such long terms. But it's important, we know. And actually, there are certain things, I think, ingrained in our biology, in our psychology, that prevent us from thinking in such long terms. So psychologically, we are always biased to the short term. We're always thinking about where our next meal is coming from, really, essentially, as humans. And that means that we've built businesses that have similarly short-termist structures. So planning, as we know, happens on annual, semi-annual, quarterly bases. And it's probably worth noting the obvious that we are not paid or awarded bonuses based on future performance. That's all about historic data too. So we're not even incentivized to think in such long terms. And this is an issue because we know that businesses that do think in the longer term outperform their peers. We see companies like Unilever, AT&T, Amazon, Marvel Studios across these different industries all succeed because they have stuck resolutely to taking a long-term view. And it's only really recently, like the past 2-3 years, that we've really had a comprehensive enough set of data to understand that it really does pay off to think in the long term. So what you can see on the slide is from the Harvard Business Review. You may have seen this report before, but it essentially shows that since the turn of the century, businesses that have a long-termist mindset consistently outperform their peers across all industries and across all financial metrics that really matter, whether that is market cap, revenue, earnings, etc., etc. And what you can actually see on this slide as well is a really clear gap that starts to widen after the 2008 financial crisis. So at that point, there then really became this wedge driven between long-termist mindset companies and short-termist companies. So my sort of provocation and build to this Harvard Business Review post is following this crisis, will we see that gap start to widen or be exacerbated? Because we know that there are certain factors and forces of change, be they social, technological, economic, cultural drivers, that will be accelerated through this period that we're living through now, and I'll touch on some of these later on. But we can expect to see this gap widen even further. So long-termism becomes even more important than it has been before. Another sort of difficulty, I think, in futures thinking that I want to touch on before we get into the meat of today's topic is that if we don't kind of dedicate the time and make the conscious effort to envisioning futures together, we struggle to picture ourselves and our teams and our businesses in that future. So we actually end up today making decisions that might actually prove detrimental because we haven't considered possibility. Or, perhaps even worse, we're stunned into inactivity and we give up our ability to make proactive decisions based on that longer-term vision. So that's the sort of urgent seed I want to plant and the reason for us conceiving of this whole session. And again, we know that today, this is about digital commerce, which is clearly a very present and influential force and factor in our lifestyles, in our markets, in our businesses. But when we're considering possible futures, there are 5 really simple key principles that we need to bear in mind. So I just want to walk you through those. And hopefully these can sort of resonate and help you to think slightly differently about change. The first is switching perspective. Often we call this looking from the outside in. So as futurists, we want to look at from the outside in at high-level macro forces of change that we can confidently project into the future that will have an impact on our future operating context. So as I mentioned before, these are social changes, technological changes, environmental, economic, political change. That's just a simple way of categorizing according to steep. You might have heard of pestle or pesto too. But thinking about those broader changes from the outside in is the ideal starting place. Secondly, we always take a longer term perspective. We take a longer view, and that's backwards as well as forwards, which enables us to see deeper patterns of change rather than just fads. It's particularly interesting when we consider the disruption that we're living through right now, because humans have been through turbulent disruptions, crises, periods of transition before, and it's really interesting to take learnings from those periods of history and apply them to what we're living through now. The third principle is about anticipating values. And why this is so important is because typically when we're looking at the future, we might speak to technologists, we might speak to economists, but they will give us very linear projections of future change. They will always overplay the importance of a technological innovation or an economic trend and underplay the importance of people's fundamental values. It is values, it's the emotional values that we hold, you and I, that ultimately are the things that cause regulations to pass or not to pass, that cause technologies to mainstream or not to mainstream, and how quickly. So don't underestimate the importance of values. The fourth is connecting the dots to see deeper patterns of change. If it comes, there it is. So connecting dots across those different categories of change is a critical part of envisioning futures. Again, as I mentioned, if you just take one technological trend and extrapolate that forever into the future, you're only going to have a very two-dimensional, linear view of that future. You'll be of the mind that that technology will take over the world or will affect everything in a certain way. If you're a futures thinker, you are a systems thinker, meaning that you are able to connect the dots between social and cultural forces of change, the values I mentioned, technological advancements, economic curves, and actually understand the mutual nuanced impacts that they have on each other. And that's what we're doing today. The fifth principle, which is why we're all here, is that we are taking off the blinkers. We're taking off the sort of parameters and assumptions and perceptions about our world today in order to reveal what might be predictable surprises. So I'm really excited to have applied all of these futures thinking principles to the future of digital commerce and to share this with you today. So I hope you're sort of buckled in and sitting comfortably and ready to embark on this journey with us. Bernard is also here to ground me somewhat and to ensure that what we explore, these futures that we envision, can really be brought back into today, into your business, into your teams, and even your personal lives, potentially.
Yeah, indeed, every journey starts with a single step. So we'll talk about some of those steps we can take immediately.
Precisely.
To get us to that longer term vision.
Great. So, hope we're ready. Underpinning this big, bad term of digital commerce are actually three big ideas. And they're on screen now. Digital, clearly, the supporting infrastructure for everything digital commerce. Retail, that is the model on which this is all built, the reason we are selling and transacting. And the consumer, the end product, the end beneficiary of digital commerce. But actually what we see looking ahead, and to my points around different macro forces and drivers of change, these are not static concepts. And so it's part of our job as futurists, as consultants, as provocateurs, to help you to reframe and reimagine some of these concepts to be more future fit. So there are three big words here. You probably all use them countless times a day, but I'm going to start with the word digital. So, digital. We're going to interrogate this term because I would hazard a guess that our understanding of it is perhaps a little bit arcane. For a while now, we've been watching the digital realm grow at a distance, perhaps. We've watched it grow in importance, in capacity, in influence. Looking back, taking that longer view, backwards as well as forwards, it's taken just over a decade, actually, for us to become so tethered to our phones. Smartphones only really started mainstreaming in 2008. So it's taken that period of time for us to become entirely absorbed and tethered to those devices. So during that time, it's kind of natural and logical that teams dedicated to digital innovation or mobile marketing or digital experience have been established, and they've grown over the last decade. Digital was, and it arguably still is, seen as this kind of new otherworldly portal realm that's accessed through this magical device that you hold in your hand and you have in your pocket. So here's the reframe for you. From now on, I want to encourage you to think differently about our definition of digital as this other realm, about the separation of digital and physical spaces. Because 2030, cue a lovely animation, 2030 is a time in which every physical space we occupy, and even many of the physical items and objects we interact with, will have an ambient digital wrapper, a sort of digital layer that exists outside the physicality of the product. It's sensor-enabled, it's responsive, it recognizes us, it's adaptive. Now, of course, when we're thinking about the macro, the high-level drivers of change that are pushing us towards this reality, of course, there are several emergent, advancing technologies becoming cheaper and more accessible to us, as you can see on a selection on this slide. So these all come together to mean that we'll experience that ambient digital world invisibly and in a number of so many different ways in our day-to-day lives. But remember values as well? It's not just tech propelling us forward here. There are also overwhelming social and cultural drivers at play. Our desire for convenience, our need for headspace, our constant quest for more quality time, all of which ambient digital can afford us. So we embrace it, right? We accelerate this trend into the mainstream. And just to give you an idea about the pace that this mainstream is kind of taking place at, compared to 2017, there are already 3 times as many smart homes in the US and Europe. So really our concerns about things like privacy or digital kind of encroaching on our physical existence aren't really concerns when we look at market trends. So, of course, a massive trend or force at play that, again, is accelerating us to this reality is the rollout of 5G networks. So this is the fundamental underpinning digital infrastructure that enables things like the Internet of Things, sensor networks, responsive and automated environments to exist. And this on screen is one of my favorite quotes from the World Economic Forum earlier this year. And to paraphrase it, essentially 3G and 4G that we know and love and sit in the palm of our hands, they were designed to put the whole world there, to have the whole world at our fingertips. 5G has been designed and will continue to be designed to take our hands out of the equation. No more conscious interfacing with a screen that disrupts our flow of our day or disrupts our relationship or communication with another person. There's a really fundamental reframe that 5G allows and enables this kind of seamless interaction. It's worth noting also during this COVID crisis that governments, private players, NGOs, you name it, are redoubling efforts and investment in 5G infrastructure given the sort of remote lifestyle working operations that we're now all slowly becoming a bit more used to. So reframing digital. I appreciate this is all kind of conceptual thus far, and actually I just wanted to land this idea with a few early signs of change. So this is another important kind of aspect of the futures process. Once we've identified some of these key shifts that we're driving towards, actually understanding how they're starting to manifest across industries becomes really critical. So I picked a couple that I thought were quite interesting. Firstly, intelligent building design. So how we see ambient intelligence being woven into the design and construction of our buildings is just fascinating. So the space that a newly constructed space will have a digital twin, so a model that lives online, that the building manager, the construction company, the landlord, the building occupants can tap into and understand the usage of the building, the projected wear and tear. It can be kind of automated notifications as to when parts or fittings and fixtures need to be replaced. And ultimately, that building can work much more seamlessly and efficiently for the people who use it. If you take that idea and extend it to a city, an entire urban environment, then all of a sudden we have sensor-enabled, digitally mapped cities that can preempt the movement of people around that environment and therefore supply utilities in a more efficient way, manage waste in a more efficient way, control traffic in a more efficient way. So we move consistently to this preemptive model that ambient intelligence ultimately allows. And a fun one for the third one. New ways of creating content and making movies. So imagine creating a video game that you could actually drop a cinematographer into, you could drop a director and actors into, and that sensor-enabled environment, with them all wearing their headsets and wearing various sensors on their bodies, reacts to their movements, just as a natural world would, but instead you're plonking actors in the savannah, for example. So if you haven't watched The Lion King from 2019, Disney's Lion King, it's worth a watch because that is a pioneering application of ambient intelligence in the filmmaking context. So hopefully a few ways that you can kind of tangibly grasp how ambient intelligence is starting to be applied. And that takes me to, I guess, something that's a bit closer to all of our hearts for this session, retail. So again, you'll see I'm a fan of a circle in this presentation. What we see today in 2020 is the proliferation of different points of sale. So again, through this wonderful magical portal of our device or our smart speaker, we can transact in myriad ways. You name it, e-commerce, m-commerce, v-commerce, s-commerce. Seemingly all of these channels are just opening up to us, and it's becoming a very difficult, complex landscape to navigate. I'm sure you can all empathize. But actually, here's the reframe. Just as we have this overlap of ambient digital, couching, kind of sitting around physical spaces and things, so too do we see retail opportunities in those those digital layers. So what I mean here is that every space, every responsive, intelligent space we enter will present commercial opportunities. I can pick up this product and it can offer me the opportunity to buy it. You don't need a sort of a traditional retail infrastructure around it for that to happen.
But that's interesting because we thought of retail as really in that consumer conversion funnel as the place where you find products and where you buy products. And that really implies, therefore, that the retail space is actually the full conversion funnel. And all of those touch points are actually about building brands and building that relationship with consumers.
Yeah, precisely, exactly. It throws sort of out of it throws everything up into kind of kilter, doesn't it? All of our sort of models and frameworks for understanding the way that people navigate channels by touch points, conversion funnels. So with 2030 representing countless sort of ways and modes to buy, I guess the job of salespeople and marketeers in this future is to optimize and ease the path to purchase, right? So I guess it depends on the level of engagement between the consumer and the category. But in some cases, you might see things like automation or nudges or in-store assistance guiding people towards a purchase in this ambient kind of intelligent environment. In other cases, it might be about making big ticket purchases that bit more accessible to consumers. So the retailer's role, the salesperson or the marketeer's role, might be about creating new shared models for ownership, for example, new models of payment or even authenticating payments as well. Your remit sort of broadens and retail is really about broader service provision in 2030. It's about smoothing out our existence between these spaces that we occupy. So again, appreciate this is conceptual, and I want to put this in real first-person terms. Again, looking backwards in order to look forwards too. Because we're really starting to see this blurring of retail and service provision in this way. So once upon a time, retailers and marketeers were firmly in the driving seat, firmly in control. It was their messaging and their communications to people that drove our desire and demand and ultimately pushed us to spend and consume. So back then, you might have said, okay, I think I need or want this thing, so I will buy it. Now, today, in 2020, people are more firmly in the driving seat. There are more opportunities to transact and just simply more choice. So channels and devices give power to the people, and today we're more likely to say, my phone, my speaker, my social media account suggested this thing to me, I will tell my phone, speaker, whatever, to buy it. Great, a little bit more seamless, a little bit more control to the people. Now let's see if my builds will go this far. Next up, people are ceding that control to algorithms. It is a fact, it's happening already. Looking ahead, the rules built from information generated by our interactions with smarter spaces, with smarter things, will automate some of these purchases for us. Not all of them, there are different levels of engagement, but a lot of these purchases will be automated. Our hand, again, is taken out of the equation. Our needs are preempted. So actually, you're more likely in the future, in the 2030 world, to be saying this, my room, my space, my car, my fridge, must have known I needed this. It's already arrived. So where does retail end and where does service provision begin? Question to you guys. Again, I wanted to bring some examples to kind of flesh this out and bring this to life. There are already so many manifestations of this blurring going on across sectors. The first two I've pulled here from Alibaba, that king of retail and guru of futures thinking, really. On the left-hand side, this could manifest as gamified spending. This could manifest as Alipay's Ant Forest, which is essentially an app that generates carbon scores for its 300 million users, by the way, 300 million, according to what they spend and purchases and transactions they make. So really, this financial spin-off of the Alibaba parent company, is becoming an arbiter of what constitutes a good purchase. They are determining what a good brand, a good transaction is by giving people these accompanying scores and giving people a real sense of value and self-worth through it as well. It's a phenomenal move. And when we think about ambient intelligence and aggregated data sets in the physical retail context, as Bernard mentioned, we see shopping in the cloud happening in Alibaba's physical stores. So the image in the middle depicts RFID, kind of sensor-enabled hangers that track people's browsing through the store, connecting that to their app, which is in turn tapped into a database of millions of different potential outfit combinations, which an AI sorts through and determines the best possible recommendations for them. And that all happens in real time whilst they're in the store, all enhancing that browsing experience. And finally, quite a kind of different approach, I think, to this idea that every space represents commercial opportunity. In Copenhagen, there's the Audo Hotel on the right here, which is a collaboration between an architecture firm and a furniture retailer. And they have essentially created a smart sensor-enabled accommodation space. You go there, you stay, just like a usual hotel, but every single item in that space is part of a digital catalogue. And you can simply scan and order and have it shipped that day, a new one, obviously, rather than the bed you've just slept in. So they're really blurring the boundaries between what constitutes a retail space and what constitutes a leisure or entertainment or hotel space. Cool. You still with me, Bernard?
Yes, absolutely.
So on to the last of the three big concepts, the three big ideas that I want to interrogate today. And this is a real passion point for me: consumer. So the consumer, as the name suggests, is currently sat at the end of a long, linear, wasteful, potentially inefficient supply chain. This chain generally starts with the extraction of virgin materials at source. We then go through several levels of complex production and processing before stuff is then distributed, marketed, sold to an end consumer who is ultimately responsible for that stuff's consumption, storage, protection, upkeep, and eventually its disposal. Kind of seems mad when you break it down in that way. But we are, I think, thankfully, looking ahead to a 2030 picture which looks more people-centric. Brands and service providers are quickly getting better at building ecosystems with you and me at the center, not at the end of that chain. The most successful service providers of 2030 are those who manage to close loops around people and with people, whether that is collaborating to find new life for byproducts or waste in a physical sense, or enabling people to establish community marketplaces or vehicles for shared ownership. So the reframe here is critical, that people are better understood and served based on their interactions with those around them and society around them, not just based on their purchase history or their history with any one category.
But to bring that into a retail world again, I mean, that really means that sort of the idea of channels, this is completely disappearing. It's probably not a new thought, this idea that we're moving to a channelless world. But fundamentally what it highlights is the fact that we are going to move to a world where my needs, my occasions, the reason why I want to purchase certain products is going to be completely tailored to my needs. And in turn, surely that implies that, to put it in a practical way, when I walk into a store, the idea of promotions that are just there for everybody is going to disappear. It's going to be really targeted at me, unique to what I would require from that shopping experience.
Precisely. And I think to build on that as well, consumers becomes a bit of a redundant term because in the future people will be contributing as much as they're consuming. That will be an expectation. So thanks to all of these sort of emergent technologies, new economic models and rules, people will be able to make and market and sell for themselves. They'll be much more empowered to make decisions, and they will want to seek a contribution to society and have an impact in a way that goes far beyond existing modes of consumerism. So you're totally right. I think a critical reframe here is that we are serving citizens, not just supplying to consumers. So, big thought to leave you with. I guess really importantly to say, when we are thinking about these futures, it is important to consider generational implications and nuances as well, because in 2030, the fact of the matter is centennials, you might know them as Gen Z, we call them centennials here, will be in the driving seat. They'll have greater spending power, they will be heads of households, they'll be the movers and shakers in the workforce, and what Kantar data tells us about their attitudes and their values is that they are more resourceful, they're more vigilant, they're more public-minded, and they're more impatient than generations before them. And to my earlier point about the importance of values, these will really be the socio-cultural drivers of connected consumption and contribution, this whole kind of landscape that we've explored together just now. Just a side note, Gen Alpha, the generation coming after them, over-index even more acutely on these thanks to the fact that their formative years have been spent living through what we're living through now. So that's also worth noting. So, nearly time for me to wrap up my future gazing section, but to recap, I want you to take the reframing of these three big concepts out of this session and into your work and potentially into your lives beyond today. Digital is not separate from physical. Digital is better understood as ambient, responsive layers on our physical realities. Retail is a service that actually smooths out our existence in this future. And the consumer is better understood by their engagements and interactions with society than with any one particular category. On that note, I'm going to stop my envisioning.
Okay, well, this is quite a transformative moment, and we've probably seen these kind of pivot points in our past before, but it feels like we're really at one of these pivot points yet again. And that's important, therefore, for organizations to think how they will react. Now, I want to sort of just talk a little bit about the difference between transitioning and actually thinking about a transformation. And the question I want to pose is, are we going to just transition, almost if you like, drift into this new sort of world that Charlie has described for us? Or is it sort of a moment where we as organizations can really transform ourselves? But just as a pause, I just want to reflect on what these two different words mean. And sorry if you're not a car geek, I'm not one either. I drive a battered old Peugeot. I'm not a Jeremy Clarkson wannabe. However, I just want to reflect on sort of car technology to make this point. Petrol engines, old technology. We all know 10, 20 years from now, we're going to be driving electrical cars. But we've got to make this transition. And hybrid technology, as we see it now, is this transition sort of aid, if you like. It's balancing out some of the limitations that we have, not enough charging points, not enough or not sufficient battery capacity, range concerns, etc. And it allows us to wait for that technology to catch up as we're managing this transition. So hybrid cars are fuel efficient, but they're nowhere nearly as fuel efficient as electric cars will be in the future. So in a way, it's just an interim technology. It just helps us to get from point A to point B. And whilst we're doing it, it's actually quite an inefficient one. We're taking two engines, putting them next to each other, running them in parallel. And that's not a true transformation. It's just sort of helping us along the path. To get to this world that Charlie describes, we've got to really transform as organizations. So what does this word, transforming means? Kind of lining up differently as organizations. And here I want to look at a different form of transport. 100 years ago, propeller engines, and still today they exist as the primary driver of aircraft. Somewhere towards the end of the Second World War, jet engines really came to the fore. Very powerful, used up huge amounts of fuel, very, very noisy, but they did have one advantage, and that is speed. And probably if you want to dwell on that, you might say, is this the digitally native brands that we have? And for them, that is their world. Indeed, pure jet engines still exist in fighter aircraft, where speed is the key driver. But actually, if you've been on a plane lately, and I guess for most of that, it means at least 7 months ago, but nonetheless, if you've been on a plane and you looked at those things under the wing, what you would see is a turbofan engine, where we've actually taken these different technologies and put them together in a new system that is actually transformative, lining them up and taking into account all of these different trade-offs that we have. It's not just speed we wanted, that's important, but fuel efficiency, massively important if you operate in an airline, and as well as noise reduction. And there's actually a very clever way of putting what is called a turbofan, but fundamentally a propeller, and a jet engine and a combustion chamber into one system and really making it operate seamlessly and integrated.
So just to, I'm not an engine aficionado, but I think I see where you're going with this analogy, and actually with this kind of combined system, even if it's in an evolving state, it can be a really optimal and efficient way of doing business and engaging with consumers. So I guess to come back to our point about the reimagination of physical retail space, actually that doesn't have to be a burden, a weight. Your legacy physical footprint or infrastructure doesn't have to slow you down as a marketeer, as a salesperson. Actually, it can be reimagined to deliver a more optimal experience and work in tandem in synergy with your online experience.
Absolutely. It's a case of letting go some of those burdens that we have and then saying what is the good bits about it and how can we build on top of it. And yes, it is still evolving, but it's actually in quite a stable state and it's quite an efficient state that we have reached. And that is really the goal, and that's really the sort of thought behind how do we get from a transition to being a truly transformed organization. But practically, what does this mean? Because we can't just be stuck in the world of transport. So what does this mean for most FMCG and CPG businesses? And actually, a good place to start looking at it is organizational structure. Typically, very linear boxes, reporting lines. Some businesses have moved forward and said, okay, we need to have this digital expertise. We need to have marketing and brand expertise and the sales organization. They start creating sort of pods, and those pods flow to each other a little bit better. But still, it feels like it's along a path of transition. What we should be getting to is saying, what are the primary aims of an organization? And actually, what we're trying to do is make sure that we build our brand equity and we deliver that brand equity building activities. And at the same time, we want to convert consumers to buying. So let's just put these words of marketing and sales completely out of the window and have two parallel systems operating as integrated, where we build brands and we convert consumers to our brands in the same time, in the same space. And that really demands us to think about our world differently. There was this big drive to sort of GBUs and global business units, and I'm betraying my Procter & Gamble past from 2 decades ago, where the idea of sort of big global brands drives efficiency. And then a few years later, there was this sort of, we've got to localize. And we saw the advent of local brands that were actually performing much better than their big global competitors. And now what we're seeing is sort of a bit of a hockey stick, where we have to get to very strong regional structures. And there's a driver for that. One is, of course, the big players, these big ecosystem players. You mentioned Alibaba. Amazon would, of course, be another one. I don't think of it as a retailer, but as an ecosystem. And then equally, Jingdong.com and Tencent, if we think of that as an integrated ecosystem. And to deal with them, we've got to have very strong regional structures that can actually help country-level operations to be efficient. And ultimately, the key thing that we want to deliver is this idea of how do we make sure that on these ecosystems, we are both building our brands and the equity of our brands, as well as converting consumers. It's no longer linear, as you pointed out earlier. These things happen at the same time in an integrated, stable state. And to really sort of say, okay, well, help me even more, Bernard. How can we make this sort of more granular today? I've got sort of 5 thoughts. And the first of these is around processes. And often processes actually come before the organizational restructure. How do I want information to flow in my organization? How do I want to have activation and execution to happen? So those process flows and mapping those is very important. And that's the first bit of transformative thinking that we need to have. I had the privilege of working on a client project this year where we looked specifically at how they can actually move from this very strong local structure to actually have more of the regional input. Secondly, we got to make sure that we then line up regional, local, and global and really define what those roles are and then put people against those roles. Another big impediment is data. And this is a slight irony because actually in this digital world, we've got more data than we could possibly hope for. Sometimes the accessibility to that data is the issue. And some of the partners in this whole kind of new retail actually keep their arms tightly wrapped around that data. And that's going to compel organizations to work with imperfect data, use their business acumen, test, learn, try new things, act, use the sort of human capital that they have, the human intelligence, and just saying, where are we on this journey? What are the right decisions to make? And that's where your piece is so important, because if we have that 2030 vision in place, it helps us to make the right decisions as we learn and as we step into this new decade. You already hinted that sort of, the role of marketeers is going to change completely. And I come from a sales background, so maybe this feels comfortable to say for me. But fundamentally, marketeers will have to be embedded with the ecosystems that exist and working much more alongside their sales colleagues. The idea of marketing driving the strategy and sales executing that is not happening. It has to happen in tandem going forward. And we're seeing some organizations doing that very, very well. So breaking down those silos between marketing and sales is a fundamental step to make going forward. And with those 5 thoughts, hopefully it sets you on a path where you can actually drive your organization towards a transformation to capture this 2030 vision that you've outlined.
Thank you. I mean, you've truly grounded my conceptual kind of reframing of those big ideas in things that we can, I think, all start acting on probably today. And I think on your last point in particular about breaking down the silos between marketing and sales, I'm finding working with very nascent companies or businesses who are just establishing themselves now, actually that language kind of disintegrates, and new kind of upstart businesses are more likely to be recruiting for head of brand experience or service delivery than they are sales or marketing. So I find that a phenomenal kind of interesting shift in the linguistics of business as well. So I guess my challenge to you as you're sat at home is how would your role look different, or how would you do it differently if your title were something along the lines of brand experience officer or client service delivery officer? So maybe something for you guys to dwell on. We're coming to the end of our time.
Yeah, indeed we are.
Thank you for taking the time with us to envision that 2030 future, that longer term tomorrow, in order to make better decisions today with clarity and confidence. If you're sticking with us in this studio, our colleagues will be following up with a closer look at digital acceleration, if you're in this digital mindset, at 12. Alternatively, we've got a panel featuring speakers from Mumsnet and Channel 4 on the COVID impact on women, which I think will be fascinating. Or if, like me, you are unsettled by just how close we are to Christmas, there is our session on winning Christmas 2020, again at 12 o'clock. But that is all from us, and thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to hopefully speaking to you down the line.
Thank you.